The gunshots echoed across the desert canyon like thunder, shattering the stillness of the Arizona night. Sheriff Thomas McKenna pulled his horse to a sudden halt, his weathered hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver at his hip. 3 rapid shots, then silence. Nothing good ever came from gunfire at this hour, especially not this close to Apache territory. McKenna had been riding the perimeter of Clearwater for the past 4 hours, a ritual he'd maintained religiously since becoming sheriff 3 years ago. The townspeople thought he was paranoid, but McKenna knew better. In 1878, the Arizona Territory was a powder keg waiting to explode, and his small frontier town of barely 200 souls sat right in the middle of disputed land. The recent tensions with the local Apache bands had everyone on edge, and McKenna had learned that vigilance was the price of keeping his people alive. The wind carried the acrid smell of gunpowder across the sagebrush as McKenna urged his stallion toward the sound. His horse, a battle-scarred bay named Ranger, snorted nervously but obeyed. They'd been partners for 5 years now, ever since McKenna's wife Sarah had died of consumption, leaving him alone in a world that suddenly felt too big and too empty. Ranger was the closest thing he had to family now. As they crested a low ridge, McKenna spotted the source of the disturbance. 3 men on horseback were circling something near the old cottonwood grove by Willow Creek, their shapes barely visible in the pale moonlight. Bandits, by the look of them. Mexican outlaws, most likely, judging by their distinctive sombreros and the way they sat their horses. McKenna had been tracking this particular gang for weeks. They'd been hitting ranches and stealing horses throughout the territory, always vanishing into the desert before anyone could catch them. But tonight was different. Tonight, they weren't alone. McKenna dismounted quietly and pulled his field glasses from his saddlebag. Through the lenses, he could make out a 4th figure on the ground near the creek. Someone was down, possibly wounded or dead. The bandits were arguing in rapid Spanish, their voices carrying on the desert air. One of them gestured angrily toward the fallen figure, while another kept scanning the horizon as if expecting trouble. Then McKenna saw something that made his blood run cold. The person on the ground moved. Whoever it was, they were still alive, and from the way the bandits were positioning themselves, it looked like they were preparing to finish the job. McKenna had sworn an oath to protect the innocent, regardless of who they were or where they came from. He'd failed to protect Sarah from disease, but he wouldn't fail another soul if he could help it. He secured his field glasses and checked his weapons. 6 shots in his Colt, a Winchester rifle with a full magazine, and a knife his father had carried in the Mexican-American War. It would have to be enough against 3 armed men. The sheriff moved through the sagebrush like a ghost, using every shadow and boulder for cover. His years as a cavalry scout before settling in Clearwater served him well in moments like this. 20 yards from the bandits, he could hear their conversation clearly now. They were arguing about whether to take their victim alive or simply eliminate a witness. The debate wouldn't last much longer. McKenna took position behind a large boulder and called out in his strongest voice, "This is Sheriff McKenna of Clearwater. You're all under arrest. Drop your weapons and step away from that person." The reaction was immediate and violent. The 3 bandits spun toward his voice, their hands going for their guns. The first shot came from the leader, a scar-faced man with silver conchos on his hat band. The bullet sparked off the boulder inches from McKenna's head, sending rock fragments into his cheek. McKenna returned fire with deadly precision, his first shot taking the leader in the shoulder and spinning him from his saddle. The second bandit got off a wild shot that went high before McKenna's bullet found his chest. The third man, younger than the others and clearly terrified, threw down his weapon and raised his hands high above his head. "Don't shoot, Sheriff. I surrender. Poor favor, don't shoot." McKenna kept his gun trained on the young bandit while checking on the other 2. The leader was clutching his shoulder and cursing in Spanish, while the second man lay motionless in the dirt. "You're going to live," McKenna told the wounded man, "but you're going to answer some questions first." As he approached the fallen figure by the creek, McKenna's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't what he'd expected to find. The person lying in the grass was a woman, but unlike any woman he'd ever seen. She was massive, easily 6 feet tall, with the broad shoulders and powerful build of a warrior. Her long black hair was braided with feathers and beads in the Apache style, and her buckskin dress was decorated with intricate beadwork that marked her as someone of importance within her tribe. More shocking still was the fact that she was conscious and watching him with intelligent, calculating eyes that held no fear, only a mixture of pain and curiosity. A bullet had torn through her left shoulder, and blood had soaked the front of her dress, but she was very much alive and very much aware of everything happening around her. McKenna holstered his weapon and approached slowly, his hands visible and empty. "Easy there," he said softly, the same tone he'd use with a wounded animal. "I'm not going to hurt you. Let me help." The woman's eyes followed his every movement, and when he knelt beside her, she spoke in accented but clear English. "Why?" Her voice was deeper than most women's, but melodious in a way that reminded McKenna of wind through pine trees. "Why do you help Apache?" The question hit McKenna like a physical blow. In all his years on the frontier, he'd never been asked something so direct, so challenging. The honest answer was complicated. The Apache and the white settlers had been at war, on and off, for decades. Most people in Clearwater would consider helping an Apache woman not just foolish, but treasonous. There had been raids, counter-raids, massacres on both sides. The cycle of violence seemed endless. But looking into this woman's eyes, McKenna saw something that transcended all the political complications and historical grievances. He saw a human being in pain, someone who needed help, and that was enough. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply, tearing strips from his own shirt to use as bandages. "What's your name?" "Ayanna," she replied, wincing as he examined her wound. The bullet had passed through cleanly, missing any vital organs, but she'd lost a significant amount of blood. "It means eternal flower in your language." McKenna worked quickly, using water from the creek to clean the wound before bandaging it as best he could with his improvised materials. "I'm Thomas McKenna, Sheriff of Clearwater. What happened here, Ayanna?" As he worked, she told him her story in halting English supplemented by gestures and expressions that spoke louder than words. She had been tracking the horse thieves for 2 days, trying to recover animals stolen from her people. The Apache needed those horses not just for transportation, but for survival. Without them, hunting became nearly impossible, and winter was approaching fast. She had found the bandits watering their stolen horses at this very creek and had attempted to take them back alone rather than risk the lives of the young warriors who had volunteered to accompany her. It was a decision born of both courage and desperation, and it had nearly cost her life. "Your people," McKenna asked carefully as he helped her sit up against the cottonwood tree, "do they know where you are?" Ayanna's expression grew troubled. "They will look. When sun comes, they will find." She gestured toward the desert with her good arm. "My brother leads war party. 20 warriors, maybe more. They will not understand why white sheriff helps Apache woman." McKenna felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night air. If a war party found him here with their wounded kinswoman, surrounded by dead and wounded Mexicans, they might not stop to ask questions. The situation could spark the very conflict everyone in the territory had been dreading. "How long before they reach this place?" he asked. Ayanna studied the stars with the practiced eye of someone who'd navigated by them her entire life. "Before the sun climbs above the mountains. Maybe 3 hours." McKenna made a decision that would change his life forever. "Can you ride?" "If I must." "Then we're getting you out of here." McKenna turned to the young bandit who was still standing with his hands raised, looking terrified and confused by the conversation he couldn't understand. "You're going to help me get her to safety, and then you're going to tell me everything about your operation. Do that, and maybe you'll live to see another sunrise." As McKenna helped Ayanna to her feet, he noticed something that made him pause. Despite her injury, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, despite every reason to distrust him, she had a dignity about her that reminded him of Sarah in her final days. The same quiet strength, the same refusal to be diminished by circumstances beyond her control. "Why do you risk this?" Ayanna asked as McKenna brought Ranger over and prepared to help her mount. "Your people will not understand. They will call you traitor." McKenna paused, one hand on Ranger's bridle, the other supporting Ayana's good arm. It was a fair question, one he'd been asking himself since the moment he'd decided to intervene. The safe thing, the expected thing, would have been to let the bandits finish their work and ride away. No one would have blamed him for staying out of Apache business. 3 years ago, he said finally, I watched my wife die inch by inch, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. Since then, I've been asking myself what the point of anything is if we can't help each other when it matters most. He met her eyes directly. Tonight, I can help. That's reason enough. Something shifted in Ayana's expression, a recognition that went deeper than words. She nodded once, a gesture of understanding that transcended the cultural divide between them. McKenna boosted her up onto Ranger's back, then swung up behind her. The young bandit, still under the sheriff's gun, gathered the reins of his own horse and the surviving animals from his fallen companions. The wounded leader, barely conscious now, was draped over his saddle like a sack of grain. As they rode toward Clearwater through the pre-dawn darkness, McKenna couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just set something in motion that would ripple far beyond this single night. Ayana rode silently in front of him, her back straight despite her injury, her presence somehow changing the very air around them. Behind them, the desert held its breath, waiting for sunrise and the consequences that would surely come with it. McKenna had saved a life tonight, but he had no idea yet what that act of mercy would cost him, or what it might ultimately give him in return. All he knew was that when morning came, nothing in Clearwater would ever be the same again. The stars began to fade as they approached the outskirts of town, and McKenna realized that in helping this remarkable Apache woman, he had just bet everything on the belief that sometimes, doing the right thing was worth any price. The first hint of trouble came with the sunrise. McKenna had barely gotten 3 hours of sleep after secretly treating Ayana's wounds in his own home, hidden away from the curious eyes of Clearwater's residents. He'd given her his bedroom while he dozed fitfully in the kitchen chair, his Colt never far from reach. When he woke to check on her condition, she was gone. The only trace of her presence was a small braided bracelet left on his pillow, made from horsehair and decorated with tiny turquoise beads that caught the morning light like captured sky. McKenna held it in his weathered palm, feeling its weight and wondering what message it was meant to convey. In his experience, Apache gifts were never given lightly, and everything had meaning in their culture. He tucked the bracelet into his vest pocket and stepped onto his front porch, expecting to see the familiar sight of Clearwater awakening to another ordinary day. Instead, he found his deputy, Billy Hutchins, running toward him with panic written across his young face. "Sheriff McKenna!" Billy called out, his voice cracking with fear. "You need to see this. Right now." McKenna followed Billy to the main street, and what he saw there made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. The entire population of Clearwater had emerged from their homes and businesses, but they weren't going about their morning routines. Instead, they stood clustered together in small, frightened groups, all staring in the same direction toward the eastern hills that surrounded their town. There, silhouetted against the rising sun like figures from a nightmare, sat at least 40 Apache warriors on horseback. They formed a perfect circle around Clearwater, positioned on every hill, ridge, and high point within rifle range of the town. Each warrior sat motionless as carved stone, their weapons clearly visible, creating an image that would haunt the dreams of every person who witnessed it. "They appeared just after dawn," Billy whispered, his hand trembling on his sidearm. "Didn't make a sound, didn't fire a shot. Just took their positions and waited. What do you think they want, Sheriff?" McKenna studied the circle of warriors through his field glasses, his mind racing through possibilities. The Apache didn't make displays like this without purpose. They were master tacticians who rarely showed their full strength unless they intended to use it. This wasn't a scouting party or a raid. This was a demonstration of power, a message written in the universal language of superior force. Among the warriors on the eastern ridge, McKenna spotted a figure that made his chest tighten with recognition. Even at this distance, Ayana's imposing height and distinctive bearing were unmistakable. She sat her horse with regal authority, her wounded shoulder showing no sign of weakness. Beside her rode a man who could only be her brother, a war chief whose very presence seemed to command the morning itself. "Billy," McKenna said quietly, never taking his eyes off the surrounding hills, I want you to go to each group of townspeople and tell them to stay calm. No sudden movements, no weapons visible. These Apache aren't here to attack, or we'd already be dead. How can you be so sure, Sheriff? Because if they wanted us dead, they wouldn't have announced themselves. Apache don't surround a town to give their enemies time to prepare. They surround a town to make a point. McKenna handed Billy the field glasses. Look at their positions. Perfect visibility of every street, every building, every possible escape route. But notice what they're not doing. Billy studied the warriors for several long moments before understanding dawned in his eyes. They're not taking cover. They're just sitting there, exposed. Exactly. They want to be seen. This is theater, Billy. The question is what message they're trying to send. As if summoned by McKenna's words, a single rider detached himself from the group on the eastern ridge and began descending toward the town. The warrior rode slowly, deliberately, his lance held high with a strip of white cloth tied near its point. A parley flag. The townspeople parted like water as the Apache warrior rode down Main Street, his paint horse's hooves echoing off the wooden boardwalks. He was young, perhaps 25, with the lean build of a natural horseman and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to respect. When he reached the sheriff's office, he dismounted with fluid grace and approached McKenna directly. I am Nailnish, he said in English that was heavily accented but perfectly understandable. War Chief of the Chiricahua. My sister Ayanna has told me of your kindness, Sheriff McKenna. She lives because of your courage. McKenna felt every eye in town fixed on him as he stepped forward to face the war chief. Around them, he could hear the whispered conversations of confused and frightened townspeople trying to understand what was happening. Many of them had probably never seen an Apache up close, and certainly never one who spoke English or claimed to be grateful to their sheriff. Your sister is a brave woman, McKenna replied carefully. I'm glad she made it home safely. Nailnish nodded, then reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew something that made McKenna's heart skip a beat. It was the distinctive silver badge worn by Sheriff Martinez of Tucson, its surface scratched and dented but still recognizable. McKenna had known Martinez for years, had shared meals and stories with him at territorial law enforcement gatherings. These horse thieves you captured last night, Nailnish said, holding up the badge, they killed this lawman 2 weeks ago. They also killed 3 of my young warriors and an old woman from our village. They thought Apache and white man would blame each other for their crimes. The implications hit McKenna like a physical blow. The Mexican bandits hadn't just been stealing horses, they'd been deliberately stoking the tensions between the Apache and the white settlers, using the existing mistrust to cover their tracks. Every raid blamed on the Apache, every retaliatory strike against Apache camps, every escalation of violence in the territory might have been orchestrated by these criminals. The man you wounded confessed everything before he died, Nailnish continued, his voice carrying across the silent street. Names, locations, plans for future raids. My sister convinced me that not all white men are enemies of the Apache people. She said you risked everything to save her life, knowing it could mean death for you if our warriors found you. McKenna glanced up at the hills where Ayanna sat watching, and even at this distance, he could feel the intensity of her gaze. She's right, he said simply. Some things are worth the risk. Nailnish smiled, the first warmth McKenna had seen in his stern features. This is why we have come. Not for war, Sheriff McKenna, but for justice. And to honor a debt. From his saddlebags, the war chief produced a collection of items that made the townspeople gasp in recognition. Jewelry stolen from the Henderson Ranch. A pocket watch taken from the stagecoach robbery last month. A distinctive rifle that had belonged to settler Tom Morrison, who'd been found dead near his burned cabin 2 weeks ago. All recovered from the bandits' camp, Nailnish explained. Along with 30 horses stolen from Apache and white ranchers alike. The real enemies of peace in this territory are dead or fled to Mexico. The Apache Nation offers this evidence of their innocence, and our friendship to the people of Clearwater. McKenna felt the atmosphere in the street shift as understanding rippled through the crowd. Voices rose in amazement as people recognized items stolen from friends and neighbors, items they'd assumed were lost forever to Apache raiders. The narrative that had shaped their fears for months was crumbling before their eyes. "There's more," Nailnish said, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "My warriors found the bandits' main camp in Devil's Canyon. Enough stolen goods to fill a freight wagon, and plans written in Spanish detailing future raids designed to start a war between our peoples. They wanted Apache and white man to destroy each other while they grew rich on our blood." Mary Henderson, whose ranch had been hit the hardest by the supposed Apache raids, stepped forward from the crowd. Her husband had been killed defending their property, and she'd been one of the most vocal advocates for military action against the local tribes. "You're saying the Apache didn't kill my James?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nailnish's expression grew somber. "Mexican bandits killed your husband, Mrs. Henderson. Same men who killed my nephew and took horses from our herd. We grieve with you for this loss." The emotional weight of this revelation hit the crowd like a physical force. Months of fear, anger, and mistrust had been based on lies. Families had been destroyed, lives lost, and an entire territory pushed to the brink of war by criminals who profited from the chaos they created. McKenna watched as Mary Henderson approached Nailnish, tears streaming down her weathered face. Without words, she extended her hand to the Apache war chief. He took it gently, and in that simple gesture, something fundamental shifted in the relationship between their peoples. "What happens now?" McKenna asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Now we hunt the remaining bandits together," Nailnish replied. "Apache know the desert. White lawmen know the towns and settlements. Together, we can end this threat to both our peoples." As if choreographed, the circle of Apache warriors on the surrounding hills began to move. But instead of tightening their grip on the town, they spread out and rode away, leaving only a small honor guard with their war chief. The demonstration was over, its message delivered with devastating effectiveness. Ayanna rode down from the eastern ridge, her bearing as proud and dignified as McKenna remembered from the night before. When she reached the group gathered around her brother, she looked directly at McKenna and spoke in Apache, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. Nailnish translated, though his slight smile suggested the words carried more meaning than he was sharing. "My sister says that sometimes the Great Spirit uses strange messengers to deliver important truths. She believes the spirits guided her to that creek last night, knowing you would be the one to find her." McKenna felt the weight of every eye in Clearwater upon him as he responded. "Tell your sister that I believe some meetings are meant to happen, regardless of the circumstances that bring them about." When Nailnish translated his words, Ayanna's expression softened with something that might have been approval, or perhaps something deeper. She reached into her saddlebag and withdrew a beautifully crafted bow, its wood polished to a warm honey color and decorated with symbols McKenna didn't recognize but somehow understood represented honor and friendship. "A gift," Nailnish explained as Ayanna presented the bow to McKenna. "Made by our grandfather, carried by our father in many battles. Now it goes to the white sheriff who proved that courage and honor are not bound by the color of a man's skin." McKenna accepted the bow with the solemnity the moment deserved, feeling its perfect balance and craftsmanship. It was easily the most valuable and meaningful gift he'd ever received, and everyone present understood the magnitude of the gesture. As the crowd began to disperse, people approaching the Apache visitors with curiosity rather than fear, McKenna found himself standing beside Ayanna as she prepared to rejoin her people. The bullet wound in her shoulder was healing well, he noticed, though she still favored her other arm. "Will I see you again?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. Ayanna studied his face for a long moment before responding. "The spirits have strange ways of bringing people together, Sheriff McKenna. When they will it, nothing can prevent it." She mounted her horse with practiced ease and looked down at him one final time. "Thank you for seeing a person in need rather than an enemy to fear. That is a rare gift in any man." As the Apache delegation rode away toward the eastern hills, McKenna stood in the middle of Main Street holding his grandfather's bow and feeling the weight of the morning's revelations. The crisis that had threatened to tear the territory apart had been resolved not through violence or military intervention, but through a single act of human compassion that had rippled outward in ways he never could have imagined. Behind him, the people of Clearwater were already talking about forming a joint patrol with the Apache to track down any remaining bandits. Children who had cowered in fear at the sight of Apache warriors were now examining arrowheads and asking questions about horses. The transformation was remarkable and complete. Billy Hutchins appeared at McKenna's elbow, shaking his head in amazement. "Sheriff, in all my life, I never thought I'd see the day when Apache warriors would ride into Clearwater offering friendship instead of war." McKenna tucked the turquoise bracelet deeper into his vest pocket and hefted the weight of the Apache bow in his hands. "Sometimes, Billy, the most important changes start with the smallest acts of decency. Last night, I helped a wounded woman. This morning, that simple choice might have prevented a war." As the sun climbed higher over the Arizona desert, Sheriff Thomas McKenna walked back toward his office, knowing that his life, his town, and his understanding of what it meant to serve justice had been permanently and profoundly changed. The lonely sheriff who had helped a giant Apache woman had discovered that sometimes the greatest rewards come not from the gratitude of those we help, but from the unexpected bridges we build in the process. The circle of warriors surrounding Clearwater had been a demonstration of power, but more than that, it had been a testament to the transformative force of human compassion in a world too often defined by fear and mistrust. And in the end, that made all the difference.